Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from today. A warm welcome to the webinar on lockdown and growing up in India's shelters. Why India's abandoned and orphaned children do not reach the legal adoption pool. As per the UNICEF State of World's Children Report 2017, about 30 million orphaned and abandoned children are there in India. Out of this, about 0.25 million to 0.5 million children live in shelters. This number is not exact because it depends on whether you're looking at a government report or a news article. No exact numbers are available. As per CARA, the Child Adoption Resource Authority, I'm going to just take 1 second stop because I'm getting some echo because of the live YouTube streaming that we're doing. 1 second. I'm back. Smriti, can you hear me clearly? Okay, great. As per the Child Adoption Resource Authority, nearly 2,000 children reach the legal adoption pool. They become legally free for adoption. It's a very, very minuscule number if you compare to the number of children that are residing in our shelters. And it had always bothered us. Why is it that we are not letting our abandoned and orphaned kids who reach shelters get adopted into safe and caring families? And I hope that this webinar today gives you some of these answers. I'll introduce my speakers today. We have with us a great friend and colleague, Smriti Gupta, who is the CEO at Where Are India's Children. Smriti used to work for Wikimedia Foundation, eBay, and Synopsys. She's an avid blogger and a child rights campaigner. We also have our pillar of strength, Meera, with us, who used to work in Oracle Corp and Apps Associate, but is right now working in child welfare. She's a director at Where Are India's Children. And I'll be your host this afternoon. I am Protima Sharma. I'm an adoption counselor. I used to work with Thermax and PCS in the past, and I also moonlight as managing partner of People Wiz Consulting in Pune. Some social rules before we start the discussions today. This is in webinar mode, so all attendees are muted. Please use the Q&A section to submit your questions. Your questions will be visible to the host as well as the panelists. Q&A. Please keep sending your questions because we can see them as you're sending them, and we'll try to respond to as many questions as we can. The session is being recorded and the recording will be made available to you on our YouTube channel. We are also streaming live on YouTube at the moment. In case if there are any internet interruptions, we've planned backups. Please be patient. When WIC came into existence, we always wondered about this question of this difference in number. We wanted to figure out what can be done to make sure that the vulnerable children in our society reach safe and caring families. India's child protection mechanism is across 700 plus districts. It is complex, it is distributed, it is human dependent, and lot of dependent on human diligence, really. With WCD Maharashtra, the Women and Child Development Ministry Maharashtra, and SARA Maharashtra, State Adoption Resource Authority, we initiated a 6-month study wherein they give us access to go and meet select shelters. They were childcare institutes as well as specialized adoption agencies to go study and find out their workflow, their processes, their data usages, their stakeholders. We visited around 9 institutes. It took a lot of time to gain their trust, for them to open up and start telling us about their challenges. We met the district child protection unit officers, we met the child welfare committee members to make sure that we are also capturing their point of view. The study identified around 20 areas with systemic gaps and provided recommendations on how technology can also plug these gaps. We have provided additional recommendations on legislative mindset and capacity recommendations. The detailed study for any one of you who's interested is available on our website. But today we're talking about what is it that we found out in terms of the 5 key reasons why abandoned and orphaned children in the shelters are not reaching the adoption pool. And maybe I'll start today with if you could tell us, in your words, what is the topmost reason that you found when you visited the shelters? Why such a small number?
Thanks, Protima. So to begin with, India does not have an adoption mindset. So what I mean by that is child's right to family is not widely understood. So I would like our audience to think about how many times they visited a shelter and thought about or wondered why there are so many children in the shelter. Have they wondered about whether the children ever get reunited with their families? Why they're not in adoption? And if not, have they asked the shelter why and how many of them are legally adoptable and why they're not in the adoption system? So shelters do have a role to play for temporarily placing these children, for housing these children when parents can't support them. But at the same time, these children cannot live in shelters forever. That cannot be their permanent home. So all of us, including the shelters and government authorities, us public, at different levels need to understand that every child deserves a family, and we need to honor that right and make it happen with some of the changes, with some of the steps we can take. And the other thing is adoption is high effort and keeping child in a shelter is low effort. What I mean by that is entering a child into legal adoption process by moving the child into different steps and then having an adoption inquiry is actually a very considerably very thorough process which is required because they have to move through different systems, and it is necessary because there are necessary checks and balances which have to be done, and this is very necessary and rightly so. But this is high effort for the shelters. So keeping a child in a shelter is low effort for them because of the processes. For example, one of the CCIs actually verbatim shared with us during the study that there is a cost to getting kids legally freed for adoption. They said that there are CWC trips and tracing these faraway families. All this takes effort, so adoption gets deprioritized. This mindset and attitude has to change. So exploring the possibility for a child to reach a family has to become the default preference of all of us in the society, including the shelters. Over to you, Pratima.
Thank you, Meera. I think it is a very sobering find that right to family is sidelined in general. But Smriti, why is that adoption is not getting the due priority by shelters? What's happening?
Thanks, Protima. So, this is where we come to our second point of one of our key findings from why children are not reaching the legal adoption pool. It is that child shelters, which are formally called child care institutions in our country, they choose not to prioritize adoption. And there are few reasons for this. The first reason is shelters primarily see their roles as child keepers. That's how they came into being. That's how they are structured. So their purpose is to keep children rather than helping the child reach another family. So now, this and I'll say that this type of role definition is important. It's important because there are children whose parents or relatives would temporarily want to house a child in a shelter due to their circumstances. So in those cases, shelters do have a role to play. But when an abandoned child or when an orphan child who doesn't have a family member, or when an abandoned and orphan child whose family never ever visits or comes check on them again, such children reach shelters, these children get stuck in shelters forever. Partly because, again, the role of shelters, for themselves being child keepers. So one common phrase that we heard from many shelters during our study, and we keep hearing it as we meet more and more shelters, is shelters essentially saying, we don't do adoption. So they sort of just kind of brush their hands off it. We don't do adoption, as if adoption is some other form of child welfare, not connected to the rest of the system, which is not correct. So shelters also have to start viewing their role not just as keepers of children, but as organizations that ensure that the child reaches a family in the best interest of the child. Now, the second reason is many of the shelters, there's a lack of training. So many shelters would have no clue about how to enter a child in the legal adoption pool. They are not regularly and periodically trained for it. They don't have any easy tools to help them guide them through the process. And even if they are trained, it may be a one-off training, and it's just adoption training and how to do it. It's not part of their overall workflow. So even with well-intentioned shelters, it may not become a priority because they just don't know how to do it. So another reason is, along with lack of training, is an ineffective linkage with adoption agencies. So let me step back. Sometime back, a very good directive was given by the central government, which stated that every child shelter must be linked to an adoption agency. Now, the purpose of this linkage was that child shelters can identify children who are abandoned and orphaned with no known family member, and then the adoption agencies can help the child shelters bring these kids into the legal adoption pool. Now, on paper, this is a great idea. Some linkages have been done, but what we found that practically it's been ineffective so far. When you can essentially, shelters can ignore the linkage. The various stakeholders in the process can again not work on the process of bringing these kids in the legal adoption pool there. So one of the frustrating parts in our study was when we talked to multiple stakeholders and we talked to them about linkages and why kids are not moving despite there being a linkage. And the answers we got from various stakeholders was, well, I have done this much, or I have done my job so far. I don't know what the next step is. I don't know what the next deadline is. I'm waiting for somebody to tell me to do something. Or so when we heard these from multiple parties and we triangulated that information, what's been happening is that even with linkages, there aren't very crystal clear guidelines on who does what, as in which stakeholder does what in terms of moving the child through the system, what are the deadlines, and what happens if you don't do it. Which brings me to my third point, which is there is a lack of penalties. So our law, states that children without families should be evaluated for adoption eligibility, and they should be entered in the legal adoption pool. But what happens if you don't? Let's say, as a shelter, there is an abandoned child that has been with me for 10 years, and I have not initiated the process of putting that child in the legal adoption pool. Today, there is no consequence for that. Right? So there is no push for the shelters to actually take on this new role in terms of penalties. And the flip side of that is incentives. So today the incentives are also misaligned. Shelters get funds, of course they get donations, and they get funds from the government for keeping children. Shelters are not measured, they are not rated, and they are not rewarded by how many children they place with families. So these misaligned incentives lead to outcomes which are not in favor of putting kids in the legal adoption pool. So those are the 4 key reasons for this particular point.
Thank you for explaining that, Smriti. I will take a related question that we are getting from the audience. We have a young listener who has asked, are all the children in government shelters in India available for adoption? Smriti, what would you say to that?
So first of all, I would like to clarify that the shelters are both government as well as private. So we do have government shelters as well as private shelters, which are and should be regulated. So are all the children available for adoption? No, not all the children will be available for adoption, because as we mentioned, that shelters are places where children can be left temporarily by their families who visit them, who want the children, who have a plan to take their children back. So a certain percentage of children would fall in that category. But then there is also another percentage of children in which case there are no families, or the families don't visit them. Now, these are the children who should reach the legal adoption pool. In fact, I would say the situation currently is the flip. So the question was that, or are all the kids in the legal adoption pool? I would say today the kids who should be in the legal adoption pool, all of them are currently not there.
Hmm. Hmm. And I think there's a related question that is coming, Smriti, and let's just address that, because I think many people might be thinking, why did we choose Pune or Maharashtra for the study?
Interesting. So, one thing is that we chose the Pune district, first of all, which is a mix of urban and some rural parts. So what picking Pune district did is gave us a diversity in the types of shelters we could talk to. So we could talk to shelters which were, main city shelters. We could talk to shelters which were more far flung and away from the town. We could talk to shelters that were linked with adoption agencies. We could talk to shelters which were not linked to adoption agencies. We could talk to shelters who had a lot of resources, right? We went into some really well-kept shelters. And we also went to shelters which didn't have a lot of resources. And, so for example, a shelter who doesn't have a lot of resources may just deprioritize adoption because, they just don't have the funds or the admin staff to do that particular part of their role. So that was one reason to pick Pune district, is essentially we could meet a huge diversity of shelters here. And in fact, Pune has about, I believe, 50 shelters and 7 adoption agencies. So it very hugely represents, what this district hugely represents what may be also happening in other districts at a national level.
And I think another reason was that we got such immense support, isn't it, in Pune, from
Yes.
WCD, from
Yes.
Sara. They were so supportive in terms of getting the access, taking us there. And we tried in other places, but Pune was amazing. That's why I would like. That's another thing that gave us a boost, saying that yes, this is something we can do here and find out more. So yeah. Moving on.
Definitely. So just
thank
to
you for
make
explaining all this and taking all the questions.
Comment there, Protima. So you're very right. It's also about we had a huge support of the government authorities here. In fact, when we started the study, we very quickly got the name of shelters and adoption agencies we could visit. But just starting those visits took a while, because unless the government authorities themselves called these shelters, emailed these places and told them to talk to us, right? We couldn't get our foot in the door. So
yeah, you're right.
Support was immense.
Very, very important. Yeah. And thanks for that. Let's look at other stakeholders in the system beyond shelters. DCPU, CWC, don't they have a role to play in ensuring that more and more legally free, deserving children reach the adoption pool? You think?
Yes. So, so as Protima mentioned, CWCs and DCPUs. So just to explain that a little bit. So at every district, there are district level authorities which monitor, regulate, make decisions about the children in that district, including the children who are in shelters. DCPU is District Child Protection Unit, which is an implementation body on the ground. Then there is a Child Welfare Committee, CWC, which is a decision-making body. So and in many districts, there may be other child protection bodies named a little differently, but they collectively play a role in protecting the children and collectively play a role in what's happening with children at the shelters. So Protima, yes, they have a huge role to play. They are the ones who are at sort of the front lines of this. And one of the key things we found out there in terms of kids coming in the legal adoption pool is that the child protection mechanism, it's distributed and it's a largely manual system. So what's happening is decisions for children are made by human-dependent manual system, which can lead to certain inconsistencies on the ground. Now, if you look at the big picture, India has about more than 700 districts. Each district would have child shelters, or most districts would have child shelters and local child protection agencies, which are humongously needed. Now, decision makers do get training and they do have to follow the law. But then also at the micro level, there is room for judgment, which could lead to certain human inconsistencies, leading the kids to fall through the cracks, because the decisions made can be influenced by the level of training, the level of competence, perhaps the biases, the opinions, and even the bandwidth of the person making the decision. I'll share an example. So for example, let's say there's a family who has a 4th child that they can't support. Now, the family could bring the child to the local child protection authorities, and they may want to surrender the child. So the child to the authorities. Now, as per our law, the parents can anonymously, they have the right to surrender the child, and the child will then go into the legal adoption pool. Now, one government authority who's perhaps more trained or more sensitized towards adoption may immediately take the child into surrender. So that's fine. Whereas another authority who perhaps may not be as sensitized towards adoption may push the parents to keep the child. And if that happens, it could be detrimental to the child. The parents may then take the child away and give the child away in legal adoption or do something else to the child. So, there on the ground, there is essentially no way of guaranteeing that the same decision is made for the same scenario for all the children across all districts. Which is why, as I said, it's a heavily manual system. And that brings me to my second point, which is that for the authorities, they don't get verified data and they don't have easy tools to guide their decision making. So these local authorities dealing with just the shelters is not their only job, right? The amount of work they do is extremely wide. So they're looking at a wide variety of cases every day. So what they need verified data and they need easy tools at their fingertips. But there are no auto recommendations or no auto tools available for the authorities to say, okay, well, in this specific case with this scenario, what should be my decision? So decision making is not easy and consistent. So I'll share another example here. So let's say I'm a local authority and I'm making a decision about whether a child's stay at a shelter should be renewed. Now, so the child's file comes on my desk. There is no built-in tool that would instantly analyze the child's data and tell me that, look, the child has been at the shelter for 1 year, the child has no listed legal guardian, and no one has visited the child in the past year. So the child should perhaps be considered for an adoption inquiry. Now, if data is analyzed and that type of recommendation is made, the local authority can perhaps think about that and act on it. But without the lack of any such data analysis or any such recommendation, it is up to the authority of how much deep dive they would do in that file. So they may look at the file, the shelter may tell them, okay, the child has been there for a year. Let's say it's a good shelter, the child is looking okay, and the authority may just decide to renew the child's stay at the shelter. So, and move forward with that because they instantly did not get any sort of input about other data points that could have gone into that decision. And similarly, along the same lines, any of the decisions makes, they're not automatically auditable. So let's say the data tells you one thing, the decision is something else. There is no way to reconcile those two and say, hey, perhaps this child's case should be looked at again. There's no such auto auditability in the system. Protima, you're on mute.
Thanks for that, Smriti. I think all of us realize that child welfare is a complex area that overlaps legal, social, psychological aspects for a child's well-being. Lot more can be done to recognize and act upon what is in the best interest of the child. But since you mentioned data as a point to worry, Meera, would you tell us how is data of children being tracked today at shelters?
Okay. Yes, Protima. So unfortunately, I think there's no unique child identity and tracking of child's movement through the system in India today. So children are not uniquely identified. We talked about the fact that, there could be up to anywhere up to 5 lakh children in shelters, but no one will be able to give you a real-time count of that actual number. And in fact, for example, if you think about it, once ECI mentioned that when a child ran away and from a shelter and was found, in another place, the child was again taken into further another shelter. Unless the child can give an information that the child came from a different shelter, there'll be a new record created for the same child. So now this child has 2 entries. A new entry is created. So this child exists in 2 systems. So essentially, we actually don't have or we don't know exactly how many children are in the system. So how do we ensure a positive outcome for them when we don't even know the exact number? So the children are not uniquely visible. So that is an issue in itself. Okay. The other thing is there is no auto tracking, no auto reporting, and auto escalation of child status in the system. So if you talk to any authority, a government authority, local child welfare authority, be it district or state, and ask them how many children in the shelters, how many don't have a family, how many have a family but they are living in the shelters, how many are in the adoption pool, or how many are pending to go into the adoption pool, there will be no immediate answers. It will be really a long drawn search, sifting through different paperwork. And even then, I'm sure the validity of the answers is questionable and not really guaranteed. So that's what we are dealing with when it comes to uniquely identifying and tracking the child's movement.
Okay, thanks, Meera. Thanks for that. Smriti, can you also tell us a little bit about gradual abandonment of children and how it happens in India?
Yes, Pratima, I can talk about gradual abandonment. Meera, just a quick check. You can hear me all right? Yes. Okay. All right. So now talking about gradual abandonment of children, I think there's maybe some signal issue at Protima's end, but I'll continue talking. So the fifth reason why that we found out during our study of why kids are not moving through the system and getting into the legal adoption pool is that gradual abandonment of a child or lack of family's interest in the child is not followed up. So what that means is, so far we have talked about, okay, Meera, you still there? Okay, looks like our participants are still there. So guys, give me 1 second. I'll share my screen now. Looks like Protima may have dropped off. So
Yes.
just give me 1 second. Let me open the screen here. Okay. All right. Meera, give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen.
Yes, I can, Smriti.
You can? Okay, perfect. Okay, so now, sorry guys. And Meera, in the Zoom, can you see the participants? I just want to make sure people didn't get disconnected.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So far, we talk about children who have families or known family members, whether that's a parent or relative, or we talk about kids who don't have known family members, a parent or relative. But there is a certain percentage of children where a family member perhaps exists, but they are either not interested in raising the child for whatever the reason may be, or they have not visited the child for a long time. So what's happening today is no expectation or visitation requirements are placed on the family. Today, if a parent or a relative left the child at a shelter, the child's profile will say, okay, this person has a known family member and the name or the address may be there, and the person never visits the child. That would be okay. The kid would continue being at the shelter. So essentially, we are not telling family members that, look, either you have a plan through which you improve your current situation and you can take the child home, or they're not being counseled about surrendering the child either, where the child can perhaps go to a new family. So both sides are not happening. We're not putting any expectations on parents in terms of raising the child. And we're also not informing them that there is a path for the child to reach another family if the parents or the relatives are never going to raise the child. Which basically means that these kids end up growing in shelters without any contact with the family. And also, today, there's no next step defined for gradually abandoned children. So for example, how would you find out whether a child is being visited by their family or not? There's no biometric or automated collection of this data. Today, if somebody visits a child, it's an entry in a register. It's a heavily manual process, and it would be very, very impossible to go through something like that and actually find the visitation history for the child. So without any automated tracking of who's visiting the child, it is impossible to flag which children are not being visited and then defining a next step for them, which would be, doing an investigation on that child again, making sure the family still exists, they are still at the same address, whether they still want the child. So all of that needs to happen. So these are primarily our key reasons for kids not moving into the legal adoption pool. So a quick summary. that things we talked about is a lack of an adoption mindset. So it by default gets deprioritized. People don't think that kids belong in families. Lots of people are okay with kids sitting in shelters. We need to move to this family for every child mindset. Then, from that mindset, then we move to the next step of ensuring that the child's shelters do prioritize this option through incentives, through trainings, and make sure there are also deadlines and timelines and penalties in place. Then the child protection system is largely manual. We need more automated help, we need more tools, we need better tracking of what's happening with the child. Going into the next point, children need a unique identity, they need to be traced through the system. And eventually, we have to also look at gradual abandonment or a general lack of interest of the family in raising the child. So I'm sure at this point.
Thank you, Smriti. I'm back. Should I?
Yes, Protima, go ahead.
I'm back.
I'll stop sharing.
I'll probably ask you. Yes, I will. You can continue sharing the screen. That's probably better.
Okay.
Just continue sharing the screen, please.
Okay.
Smriti and Meera, can I just quickly ask you guys to have a look at the questions which have been coming in, because I lost connection. I lost the questions which have come in the past half an hour. You might be able to see them still. I would like to answer some of those. But before we get to the questions that we're getting from the audience, and let's get into what is it that WISC is doing about some of this. All the issues and the problems that we listed are not insurmountable. Yeah? There are solutions to all of this. At the end of the study, we could identify almost 20 areas where we could come up with a technology solution, or a legislative solution, or a process change, or a capacity building, or a mindset change that can help in bridging this number and this minuscule number that we see today. Our organization has been working on creating these technology solutions. We are trying to come up, we've conceived a child life cycle management system, which should be able to ensure that the children become visible, their movement through the system gets tracked, kids who should be put in the legal adoption pool, they are getting flagged, and there is real-time verified data and reporting. We're trying to do all of that. And you can help us by reaching out with any technology solutions, offers for technology partnerships. You can help us in getting government permissions for running pilots in various districts for this technology solution, or even help us in securing funding for the initiative that we've taken. But beyond what the government and the NGOs like us can do, what about you and I as a concerned citizen? What is it that we can do? I'll let Meera respond to that. Meera, you're muted.
Thanks, Protima. So yes, there are absolutely a few things we can do. We all should know, as concerned citizens, as you mentioned, that India does have a legal framework, adoption framework, and legal adoption agencies to take care of adoptions. So if you ever come to know of a parent or a guardian who is unwilling or unable to raise their child, direct them to an adoption agency to safely surrender the child, rather than giving up the child in a general shelter, where the possibility of the child growing up in the shelter is extremely high. The other thing we often do is we visit shelters, maybe for birthdays, for anniversaries. But when we do go and visit the shelter, ask the shelter some very pertinent questions, such as, do the children living there have family? Does the family visit them? Whether the shelter is linked to an adoption agency? Are they legally adoptable? How many are legally adoptable? Make sure the shelter can actually answer these questions satisfactorily. And based on that, it is your choice if you would like to engage with them or not. Further, there's another thing. If you are really motivated in making a difference and contributing, you can find the contact of the child district protection officer in the local WCD website and check with them about why the shelter is not following the rules and acting in the best interest of the child. Not necessarily to vilify the shelter, but more from the best interest of the child. And as a civic society, I think when we engage and ask the right questions and approach these issues keeping the best interests of the child, then the shelters, the authorities, the government will also start thinking on the same lines. And I think we owe it to the children of our country. Over to you, Protima.
Thanks, Meera. Thank you for that. And I see a very interesting question that has popped up. And I was wondering if maybe Smriti, you could respond to it. What is the one thing that, if implemented, will have the most impact? It might not be a policy level change, but maybe a low hanging fruit, any small tweak. Is that possible? Is that possible, Smriti, to think of a small thing that can have a huge impact?
A low-hanging fruit that can have a huge impact. Wow.
Impact.
You know, I know I have to like go through the whole study in my head right now and pick that. Okay, so I can't promise that this is the lowest hanging fruit or this would have the most impact, but I can tell you the main thing that comes off the top of my head. I think there have been studies done in the past which have talked about the percentages of children in shelters that could potentially be in the legal adoption pool. So, for example, there was a study by NGO based in Mumbai, which I think said about 16% of kids in each, on average, in shelters could reach the legal adoption pool. So, I would say a simplest thing, process-wise, in each district would be, hey, our 16% of the kids of this district shelters are in the legal adoption pool. And if they are not, why that number is not being. So essentially, it's about setting a goal. So today we keep saying, okay, this has to be done for the kids to come into the legal adoption. This has to be done. There has to be incentives. There has to be penalties. There has to be technology, and all of them needs to be there. But how about setting that one goal and tracking every district and saying, why isn't in this district that number 16%? So when you give that particular goal to the local authorities, they'll also know what to work towards. So I do want to here acknowledge that everybody we met during the study, whether those were shelters, whether those were adoption agencies, whether those were government authorities at the district level, they are all trying to do their best. They're all trying to do their best in their own way. They all have their priorities. They have their own bandwidth issues. So, but they're dealing with a very, very complex issue. They are making sure they do right by the child. And sometimes there can be a gap in terms, because as I said, as a country, we haven't yet moved towards a very adoption right to family mindset, which a lot of Western countries have moved towards that mindset. We haven't. So that's a whole mindset change that our country has to shift. But I would say, Protima, one low hanging fruit would be you take that number and just, how you have a target, you set that target per district.
Yeah, thanks for that, Smriti. And I remember one question that had come in, and maybe we could just answer that also. Somebody asked, is there enough pressure in the system? Are enough people registered for adoption?
Yes.
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 Huge, I wanted to say yes.
Big yes. So
30,000, I think last count.
30,000.
Yes, 30,000.
30,000 and 2,000 children in the legal adoption pool. So yes, there is, and I do want to acknowledge that a lot of these 30,000 parents do want young children in what is called normal category, which is perfect health. But that said, we see a growing positive trend in our country where people are willing to adopt kids with special needs, where people are willing to adopt older children. So yes, the parents who would want to adopt them are there. In fact, that is a lot of sensitization we do with shelters. When shelters say, oh, I have a 7-year-old girl, nobody's going to adopt her, I tell them, guess what? There is a waiting queue for a 7-year-old girl. So if you put her in the legal adoption pool, she's going to get a family tomorrow.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's also so true. I think another related question that I remember somebody asking is about the types of shelters. So are all of them linked to CARA? Somebody asked, are all of them linked to CARA? Are they government? Are they non-government? What are the different kinds of shelters that we have?
Okay, so there is a huge fragmentation in how shelters are run in our country. So we have different government departments. We may have social welfare, which is I think now called social justice in many places. Then we have women and child development. Then we may have tribal welfare. So we do have various departments, and what unfortunately tends to happen is a lot of these institutions which have children get fragmented under different departments, which adds to the problem. One of the shelters we visited during our study was a shelter for special need children. I asked them, hey, are you connected to WCD? And their answer was, no, we come under, I think they came under the social welfare department. They were registered as a trust, like a very different registration. And they had no clue. They were like, adoption, what is that? So that is one challenge. And I think there needs to be, again, a legislative outlook on this, which says it does not matter which department you come under. It, as long as you are a charitable institution housing children in a permanent fashion, you need to be linked to an adoption agency.
Yeah.
Protima, to add to that, what happens is sometimes I think good Samaritans start a child home, with a few children, and then it keeps growing, and they become a child home, a shelter without knowing the rules they have to follow to be linked to an adoption agency and such. So that is also major part of these shelters.
You're right. You're right. I think somebody's also asked, I'm a prospective adoptive parent. What is it that I can do? Should I just go and volunteer at the shelter? Will that help them speed up the process?
Um, so I would say yes, definitely go volunteer at a shelter. Good volunteers are always needed. That will not speed up your process because it's a centralized process. It's I have to give credit to it. It's a very fair and transparent process. So you're talking about the process once the child has entered the legal adoption pool. So that process has been streamlined. It's a first come first serve system. People get a child based on where they are in the queue. But I would say, please, yes, if you want to volunteer, definitely volunteer. In fact, I would say go volunteer with a few shelters and teach them how to get linked to adoption agencies.
We're getting a lot of questions around adoption process for OCI, international adoptions. I think we'll respond to those questions on our YouTube video in comments. We can talk more there about the adoption process. Let's focus, continue the focus on the child shelters and what is it that we can do there. Any questions that you see, Meera, Smriti, that we can pick up probably from the list?
Let me take a...
Yes, I think one of them is asked, I think, a relevant question to the study, which says, what role can technology play in streamlining the process, leading to more children landing up in the adoption pool? I think I'll partly answer it, but I'm sure Smriti will, add to it. I think we talked a little bit about how, there is no unique identification and how there are no, auto-verifiable or auto-trackable, auto-editable, auto-auditable kind of reports and dashboards, which these governing authorities can have on their fingertips. So I think that becomes very important in such a vast distributed system to have the information related to pretty much every single child on your fingertips. And that is something in the study we have also done, part of the study, we've also given a lot of technology recommendations for each of the gaps we have found. Smriti, you want to add something?
Yeah, agreed, Meera. I think just the transparency and tracking in the system is extremely important, and I think it not only not because just to remove the bottlenecks from the system, just because this has to be visible at every level. If a state CM or if a state WCD minister has to basically get a 2-month survey done just to find out how many kids are in the shelter, or just to find out, okay, how many of those kids have parents or don't have parents, or how many kids are in the legal adoption pool, the difficulty of that manual process would by default not make that thing become deprioritized. So this has to be in the fingertips. These are our kids. We have to insert the right systems here so that the kids can go through it. I noticed a question here which says, does India not have a fostering system using foster families as a temporary bridge to adoption? So I would say India has excuse me, my slides keep moving. So Protima, I should go back to the previous slide, right?
You should.
Yeah, one second. Okay. So to answer that question, I would say India has a foster system for very specific cases in only the big metros. So let me put it that way. It's not like a Western foster care system where a child goes into a foster home and stays there until they find an adoptive family. I think in big metros, what some shelters are doing, they're placing very young children, babies, with certain families until the child gets adopted. So so the fostering hasn't taken off in a big way in India yet. And yes, it can be a bridge, but it's not currently in India the way essentially it would need to be for it to be heavily linked to adoption.
So they also, do you want to tell us a little bit on the technology front? It's not as if they don't have system, right? So there is track child, there is some version of entering the child data and biometric and all that. But where does that fall? Where does that, really conk off and doesn't help? What happens?
Yeah. So there is currently an existing technology system. I would say it's more of a database. It's a database of children. What we are talking about is essentially more dynamic use of technology. Technology that tracks, technology that assists, technology that triggers, technology that reports, technology that aids the entire process. But the fact that there is currently a system and a database is a good thing. One of the positives we found when we went for the study is every single child shelter, whether that was, just a child shelter or an adoption agency, and adoption agencies are also child shelters, they told us that they have to enter every single child in that system. Without fail, every single one of them said, I have to enter a system into this child, otherwise I won't get my funding. So it was good to see that level of base exists. Like, these shelters are now used to the idea that there's going to be a system that they have to use to manage the child. But what we are doing is we are saying, okay, we have to go beyond database and we have to go beyond basic reporting, and we have to make this system do more, dynamic assistive work. So a lot of things such as identify the child, flag the child who should be put into the legal adoption pool, that can be done by the system, so that the system can actually notify the local authorities and says, look, in your district, there are 50 kids who have been flagged. Please look at their cases, please put them in the legal adoption pool if, that they are eligible for that.
Yeah. And the technology exists today that can be used, to solve all these issues of, children not having fingerprint available. Though, I mean, we can overcome all that with the kind of technology solutions that can be looked at. Related question, and I was also thinking maybe we should spend a little bit more time on this, is somebody asking, did I understand correctly? There is no standard operating procedure for gradually abandoned children currently. This finding is sobering. Smriti?
Yes, that's sort of the short answer. Now somebody would say, look, it depends upon your interpretation. You can read the JJ Act, which is the Juvenile and Justice Act, and you can. So it can depend upon who's reading it. Somebody, a more sensitized person who's reading that act can say, well, the act says an abandoned child has to be brought into the legal adoption pool. If a child has not been visited for 2 years, that's effectively abandoned, so that child comes into the legal adoption pool. Right. So, but then that you require that type of a person to read that and, understand that out of the law. But if somebody else reads the law and they say, oh, I just need to, at the time the child is found, the child was not abandoned, they had somebody, so the child can now be in a shelter forever. Right. So it also depends upon how sensitive you are and how thorough you are in following that rule and guideline, how you interpret it. And this is what we mean by slight inconsistencies on the ground. So yes, for gradual abandonment, where a child hasn't been visited, right now, there is nothing very, concrete, or again, something very penalty or incentive based that would say, put this child in the legal adoption.
Okay, great. I think, again, let's quickly answer this question because I'm sure people are thinking about it. Won't Aadhaar help? Just having Aadhaar for children, would that make tracking easy?
Okay, so the system does require children to have Aadhaar. The current database requires the children to have an Aadhaar card. There's a government directive requiring all children to have an Aadhaar card. But what's happening is, again, it's being used in a very static manner. What I mean by that is, for a child's entry, you can enter the child's Aadhaar number, but it's in the system, it's not being used in a biometric fashion. So two things. First, for children, you can build something that is on top of Aadhaar, but you need something like Aadhaar plus plus. Because even in Aadhaar, right, the children's fingerprints can change over time and other things can change over time. So you need a child-friendly, child-specific system, essentially, and built on Aadhaar perhaps, which is Aadhaar plus plus. And then once that's there, right, it has the entry of it, the management of it has to be somehow biometric, and it shouldn't have to be manual. So Protima, to give you an example, let's say there is a child in Pune, a child with a family who's begging, and the authorities, look into it, they take the child away, the family promises they will never make the child beg again, and the authorities give the child back. Now, let's say this child has entered the system under some name. Now the family moves to Nasik, and they start the begging process there again. The child gets, the authorities find the child again, and now the family changes just the child's name and gives a different name. Guess what? It's a new child in the system. The authorities in Nasik will never know that the same child was put into begging in Pune. So that type of connectivity is not there because the biometric use of Aadhaar is not there in the system. And like I said, we anyway need something like Aadhaar plus for the children.
Okay, yeah, that's so true. I think we're also getting quite a few questions around national and international, I think domestic and international adoption. Maybe just one relevant point that we can respond to is there a separate database of children that go to the international adoption pool as against going into the domestic adoption pool? Is there anything like that?
There is no separate
Yes,
database. The way it works is that children first become available for adoption within India. And after a certain time period, if they haven't been adopted in India, they become available for adoption internationally. Now, there are different segments in that. Children who fall in normal category, they are given more time to be adopted in India because they tend to get adopted in India, whereas children who may have some special need may be made visible to international parents sooner because the probability of those children being adopted in India is slightly lower. But it's the same database, it's the same children, it's just that Indians get priority.
Okay, great. And maybe, Meera, maybe you can answer to this one, which we are getting. Is it possible for any government agency or NGO to have a database of all the shelters and sensitize each of them towards joining an adoption agency? Is anything like this happening?
Right now, I don't think so, because I think the sensitization programs are something which should be done, but right now it's not. So essentially, we are talking about training the non-government shelters, the NGOs, to say that, to actually train them that family for every child is required, right? So this is not done by the government, but it does not stop people like us or people, NGOs like us, to take this to the government and say that we could do this training. So that is something I think which is necessary to sensitize the NGOs, the shelters, and there are shelters who are basically registered CCIs but not linked to adoption agencies. So we have to look at those as well, because they also need to bring those children which are in their CCIs to the adoption agencies so that they could go into the adoption pool as well.
Meera, I do want to add that there are some efforts in pockets. So, for example, we know of another NGO that has done work in going to CCIs and training them about adoption processes. But I would say it's very much, again, it's in pockets. It's wherever an NGO has the funds or the volunteers or the employees to go do something like that. It's not on a pan-India level.
So there's no consistency as such. So I think it has to be in a consistent space. Yeah.
Smriti, do you want to add a line about what WAIC plans to do in this area?
Yes, sure. So Protima, you already talked about. So I think one thing is we want to look at this at scale. So in terms of scale, that's where we are talking about, technology solutions that across the board, when they have an impact, they have an impact across all districts in India. And now, so that's on a scale level. And then on another level, we are hoping to work with certain governments to work on a family for every child program where we could go to shelters and not only sensitize them towards adoption, but essentially bring to them, certain advantages and certain, I would say, some support system for them to say, okay, well, this is how you get trained to put a child in the legal adoption pool. This is the benefit of putting the kids in the legal adoption pool. This is why you should do it. So we do plan to roll out something like that in the near future with the shelters. But I do want to say that for that, the support of the local authorities is very important. It doesn't happen without that.
I think it's more of a comment that is coming rather than a question that says, and I think all of us do agree, it says, if it is possible to bring a proper process and data collection to elections, taxes, IRCTC, it should be possible to do that for child adoption also. It just shows that the government has not given it the right property and needed funds to operate.
Yes, you're right. Yes. If we can bring it to so many other complex things, we can bring it to this. And I would say that the rest of the elements are in place. You have the right laws. There may be some loopholes that need to be fixed, but overall you have the right set of laws. You have the local authorities, so you have the infrastructure in place. And once the children do reach the legal adoption pool, the part 2 is fixed. Right, we're talking part 1 here. We are saying, why are these millions of abandoned and orphaned children not coming into the legal adoption pool? Once they come, the government has already streamlined part 2, which is, the kids getting adopted. So that part is also in place. We have more than 350 adoption agencies in our country, and about 9,000 shelters. So that linkage is also very much possible. So you're very right. If we can do it for everything else, why not this?
And I think another interesting question directly for us, it is Smriti and Meera, have you, WAIC, engaged so far or reached out to corporates to raise awareness or raise funds for adoption of technology solution? Is that something that you're thinking about doing?
Yes, we have reached out in the past. We can definitely do more of it. We have reached out and we will continue to do so. I think one interesting challenge we run into with just with some of the corporates is what we are trying to do, I think, is something that is not very common. What we are trying to do is we are trying to put a functional path in place for children to reach a family. Whether that's through training, whether that's through technology, whether that's through sensitization. So that is what we are doing. And I think a lot of CSR or company type of efforts are geared towards certain things that are perhaps a little bit more tangible in terms of, school education. What I'm saying, what we are doing is tangible. What I'm trying to say is bringing technology to change a social sector, that to child welfare is something that perhaps is a little new for many corporates. But we hope that as we do more of this and more people get interested and understand, what's happening on the ground and what needs to happen, we should be able to link up with more corporates.
Yep.
Right. I think we've tried to answer, we've flooded with questions. They're coming one after the other, and I'm a little conscious on the time also. But we will, we promise you, we'll try and answer everything on our YouTube video comments, definitely.
So what we'll do, as Protima said, Protima is going to save all the questions. So what we'll do is we'll post your question. So when we upload this video to YouTube, we'll post the question, and underneath that, we'll write our answers.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Yep.
I think any closing remarks, Meera or Smriti, or should we just move?
I would say
that you'd like to respond to.
No, this is good. I'm glad to see the participation
in
this. I'm really glad to see how many people want to learn more, how many people want to do more. So thank you.
Yes.
Yeah,
I think I would like to add that, this gives us hope that there is hope for, our child welfare system to get better. And maybe we can do more webinars, informative webinars about the work we do in future too. Yeah,
sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Smriti and Meera, for the insights. And I thank all the attendees, participants, for being with us, sending your questions and engaging with us so much. Session recording is going to be available on our YouTube channel, and a detailed report is also available right on our website. When you go there, you'll see a tab right there that says Report 2020. For any details that you want to see, what we're suggesting in terms of solutions, any ideas that you have there, we're more than happy to hear from you. Do write to us with questions and comments, and we'll try to answer as much as we can. Stay safe and keep the little ones who are also locked down in your prayers. Goodbye for now. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.